I led with Genesis 3 because I want you to see some things about it. Whether this is literal history or figural history, it refers to reality. It's about a real failure in a real human past that we have grown up inheriting. And I'd like you to just see its brilliance. It is a brilliant story. What is it that it's trying to get across to us? Well, first, let's talk about what we're not talking about. We live in a world where we have a nice warm core and mantle, and it creates things like continental drift, plate tectonics, volcanoes, Hawaiian Islands. Well, that's kind of a mixed blessing, right? I mean, no volcanoes, no Hawaiian Islands. So philosophy tends instead to distinguish between natural evil and moral evil. And sin is moral evil. You know, murdering, stealing, idolatry, etc. is moral evil. And that's what we're talking about. Jesus is clear about that distinction in Luke 13 when he poses a question to the audience. When the tower fell and killed 18 of your people, was that because they had sinned worse than other people? No. Nevertheless, repent, because you don't know when a tower is going to fall on you. Gravity is not the problem. And building methods aren't even necessarily the problem, although some are better than others. But he distinguishes moral evil from natural evil in that statement. Nevertheless, we should be prepared for both by depending on God in the right ways. Another distinction I want you to make. We are very good at associating sin with guilt. In fact, I think we tend to think of sin exclusively in terms of guilt. Sin is a word, the way we usually use the word, it means everything I've done wrong that has some kind of penal quality to it, which calls for a judgment of guilt and a consequence along the lines of punishment. And guilt, sin involves guilt. I don't want to take that away, but what I'd like to do with this lecture is expand the category of sin beyond mere guilt, to look at other things that are also sin. Because if sin is just guilt, then all God needs to do is to take care of our guilt, and everything's fine. But if sin is bigger than guilt, then forgiveness won't be enough. Atonement and salvation will involve more than just being forgiven of our own personal guilt. These italicized words I'm showing you are words to associate with sin. Moral evil, guilt. I've already mentioned failure. Failure is what happens when you're given the opportunity to do something and you don't do it. And I like that word for Genesis 3 because it seems like a student one year asked, is Eden just a setup? Did God just make it all the way it was to set us up to fall? And on the contrary, I think God set us up to succeed. I think we had everything we needed to succeed. And we decided to take the one way that wouldn't. And the fact that we so often frame the question in a way that makes God out to be the bad guy shows you that we're affected by sin. Right? The woman you gave me. It was all set up. You wanted us to fall, didn't you? That's just a symptom of the problem. In the fact that we've framed it the way we have. Sometimes you'll be asked, where does sin come from? Now, if all things come from God, sin is a thing, then sin has to come from God too, right? Well, no, that doesn't sound right. But then there must be another creator, like an evil creator. That's what the Zoroastrians thought. There was a principle of light and there's a principle of darkness. There were two great powers responsible for two great forces that were at war with one another. Augustine was one of those for a while, actually a later variety called Manichaeism. He was a Manichae for a while, thinking that good came from the good force and bad came from the bad force, and there were two different opposing substances that were always at war. And he realized that doesn't work, actually. Sin isn't another thing alongside the things God made. Sin is against what God made. Sin is a contradiction, all right? God speaks. Diction. Let there be light. Let there be. Let there be. Behold, it's good and blessed. And sin speaks against what God speaks. Sin says, no, I'm going to eat that fruit anyway. No, I'm going to kill him anyway. Sin is a contradiction. It doesn't come from God. It doesn't start with God. In Genesis 3, where does it start? It starts with us. That makes sin, in Augustine's language, a lack. Not a thing in and of itself, but a lack, an absence. A negation of good, or a privation of good. All right? Sin is an absence of what is, rather than sin being something alongside something else. All right? Sin is not a thing in itself. Sin is a word we use to describe the lack of something. In this case, the lack of goodness. Like we use the word zero to describe nothing. Zero is not a thing. It doesn't point to a thing. It points to no thing. All right? We use the word cold. And you can misuse the language and put yourself in a mental pretzel by trying to figure out what this thing is, because it's a noun, and a noun is person, place, or thing. And zero's a thing then, so what kind of thing is zero? No. Cold is not a thing. Cold is an absence of heat. Right? Learn to think of sin that way. It's an absence of goodness. It's like a vacuum. C.S. Lewis puts this to work in The Great Divorce by describing hell as a place that's practically non-existent. It's ethereal. It's vanishing. It's tiny. It's nothing. It's verging on nothing. And heaven is real and hard and vast. And when we're saved, we're made real. That's a Platonistic way of conceiving of sin, and I think a helpful way. Or let's use this language in some other senses that are basically along the same lines. God gave us authority in Genesis 2. God gave us power. God gave us good things. God gave us purpose, meaning, fellowship, life. And we're accountable, or we're responsible for all those good things that have been entrusted to us. What happens in the garden? What happens later? What happens in my life when I sin? We're all acting irresponsibly. We're acting in a way that's heedless of the responsibilities of the good things that we have. All right? Sin is a kind of irresponsibility. Exploiting what's good and what's God's, not for God's purpose, but for others' purposes, for my own purpose. She saw that the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom. The tree of knowledge is a good thing. God made it. It had a good purpose. I think it's there to allow us to trust. When it's there, that gives us a relationship we wouldn't have had otherwise. It gives us a relationship where we can trust God and not do what God has told us not to do. And in obeying God, we learn a relationship of trust, which is not available to us if there's nothing to trust Him with. And we took that opportunity to build and learn trust, and we turned it into occasion to mistrust, doubt. That was irresponsible. Other ways that are along the same lines, sin is called darkness a lot in the scriptures. Darkness is the absence of light. In the dark, you stumble around. You can't find your way. Foolishness is a word for an absence of wisdom. Foolishness is just, we kind of use the word stupid for it. And when I sin, don't you? I come back to my senses at some point and I think, what was I thinking? They must have been thinking that. What were we thinking when we ate of that fruit? So sin is foolishness. What God gives and has and is wisdom. And sin is the contradiction of wisdom and the ignorance of and refusal of wisdom. Or God is truth, right? And so a word used again and again for sin is lie. A lie is a claim that looks true, acts true, seems real, but isn't. If I'm late to class and I make up an excuse, I had a flat tire, and you're like, weren't you in chapel? I'm making a claim that's supposed to be a real claim, and I'm passing it off as real and misleading you into putting your trust in something that isn't. We have power, we have authority, we have good and significant qualities that make us uniquely human and allow us to image God. And if you wonder where sin's power comes from, if sin isn't a thing in the first place, think about the power of lies. Where does the power of a lie come from? It comes from the trust of the people who believe it. Right? It comes from people lending it power that it doesn't have in and of itself. It has no power in and of itself. That's why when they're exposed, they lose their power. There's nothing there. There's nothing in foolishness except what people lend it. So the power of sin is not its own power. It's borrowed, it's stolen, it's defrauded, etc. And this is how a world that is can become a slave to something that isn't. Students in doctrine over the years have asked, so why is there sin in the world? What's it for? There can be no answer to that question. If there were an adequate answer to that question, it wouldn't be sin. It would have a sensibility of its own. It would have an intelligibility. It would have a purpose. There is no making sense of lies. They don't make sense. They have a kind of outward intelligibility, but when you investigate them inside, there's nothing there. Foolishness doesn't make sense. It's senseless, right? So there's no making sense of sin. And when you come to your senses, which is a nice phrase in context, when you come to your senses, you'll see the illogic of it. One last point. When the Word became flesh, when God Himself took on human life, God did so in the life of a Jesus who is fully human and fully sinless. There is no one in world history who compares to Jesus for having admirers, whether or not they actually believe in him as the Lord or follow him. So the world doesn't look at Jesus living a good life and think, what a freak. He needs to get more human. We look at Jesus and we think, oh, that's how it's done. You know? We're so used to taking moral evil as a given. Well, of course there's aggression. Some of you are reading E.O. Wilson, right? And you're reading about where human aggression comes from and where human sexual attraction comes from and where all the behaviors that it leads to come from. And they're all given a kind of evolutionary survival value. And maybe that's all true. Don't jump to the conclusion that moral evil is built into who we are. Built in. We tend to think that normal equals average, in which case the normal human being is a sinner. But norm means standard. And Jesus is the norm. And the way his life has been received by the people who have known it and read it just demonstrates that. Jesus is the norm. And because Jesus has lived a normal human life, a life that's uncharacterized by failure, irresponsibility, absence of good, foolishness, lying, absurdity, and the like, because he's come and lived that life, we are in a position to know that sin is not natural. Sin is unnatural. Sin isn't human. Sin is falling short of human. Jesus didn't come to make us X-Men. All right? Jesus' arrival shows that we suck at being human. And he's the one who doesn't. And so he shows us what real humanity looks like. It looks like love, and it looks like mercy, and truthfulness, and honesty, and character, grace. And shows us that we fall short, but also shows us hope of a way of being human that doesn't fall short, which turns out to be ours as a gift.